On the night of the 22nd of March 1945, on the west bank of the Rhine, two American infantry divisions were making a great deal of noise. Tanks moved through the villages behind the line. Radio traffic crackled between battalion headquarters. Military police wearing divisional patches waved convoys through the crossroads. German observers on the far bank counted what they judged to be 30,000 men massing opposite them and reported it up the chain. There were 1,100. Almost everything the Germans saw, heard, or intercepted that night was a lie, and most of the men telling it were artists. The unit had a number and very little else. It was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and it appeared on no order of battle any German intelligence officer could have consulted. Its equipment inventory listed rubber. Its most valuable weapons were phonograph recordings and radio operators trained to imitate another man's touch on a telegraph key. Between Normandy and the Rhine, it carried out 21 separate deception operations against the German army, and for the next half-century, not one man in it was permitted to say a single word about any of them. Some of them died before the file was opened. They went into the ground having told their wives, their children, and their own fathers nothing whatsoever about their war. A few were asked at reunions what they had actually done in France. They said they were engineers. It was the cover story the army had issued, and it worked precisely because it was boring. They held to it for 50 years, including with the people who loved them most. This is the story of what 1,100 men did to the German army, and of the price the United States Army charged them for it afterwards. In the winter of 1943, the Army went looking for a particular kind of soldier, and it did not look in the places armies usually look. Recruiters went to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. They went to Cooper Union in Manhattan. They went to the Philadelphia College of Art and to advertising agencies and to architecture offices. They wanted men who could draw, who understood how light falls on a surface, who knew what a thing looks like from 400 yards away. The Army had decided it needed people who could make one object convincingly pretend to be another. The men who answered were not what a 1944 rifle company looked like. One was a 22-year-old fashion illustrator from Indiana named Bill Blass, who would spend the 1960s and 70s as one of the most recognized names in American clothing. Another was a painter from Newburgh, New York, called Ellsworth Kelly, whose work now hangs in the Museum of Modern Art. A third was Art Kane, who became one of the defining photographers of his generation. They were issued rifles. They were also issued paintbrushes, and the paintbrushes mattered more. The unit was activated on the 20th of January 1944, and it was assembled out of 4 pieces that had almost nothing to do with one another. The 6th and 3rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion handled the visual work. The 32nd Signal Service Company handled sound. A Signal Company Special handled radio. The 406th Engineer Combat Company handled security, and was the only part of the outfit that fought in the ordinary sense. 4 small units, one purpose, and a mission statement most of the American Army would not have believed. What the Army was asking for had no real precedent. It did not want a camouflage unit that hid things. It wanted a unit that produced things, out of nothing, in places where nothing was, and made the German army believe in them long enough to move its reserves to the wrong place. If it worked, no one would ever be able to prove it worked, because success looked exactly like a quiet sector. If your father or your grandfather served in an engineer or a signal outfit in Europe, put his unit number in the comments now. Half of what those units did has never had a name attached to it. The first weapon was rubber. The unit carried inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft made of rubberized canvas and filled by air compressors. A dummy Sherman weighed about 93 pounds and could be carried by 2 men, then inflated in around 20 minutes. From 400 yards, and from any aircraft above a few thousand feet, it was indistinguishable from 40 tons of steel. Up close, it was hopeless. Photographs exist of a single soldier lifting an entire tank over his head, which is the reason the story survives at all. The second weapon was sound. The 3132nd Signal Service Company had gone to Fort Knox in Kentucky with engineers from Bell Laboratories and recorded armored and infantry units doing ordinary things. Tanks moving on roads, bridging equipment being unloaded, men shouting. Those recordings went onto wire, and the wire went into half-tracks carrying speakers that weighed around 500 pounds. On a still night, the sound of an armored division could be pushed roughly 15 miles into German-held country from a vehicle carrying no ammunition at all. The third weapon was radio, and it was the most technically demanding of the four. Every wireless operator has what the trade calls a fist, a rhythm on the key as individual as handwriting, and German intelligence tracked American units by listening for particular fists. So the deception operators studied the real operators of the units they were impersonating, learned their rhythm, then took over their traffic when the real unit slipped away. The signals kept coming from a place the division had already left, in the same hand, at the same hour. Nothing on the German situation map moved. The fourth weapon had no equipment at all. The men called it atmosphere, and it was pure theater. They painted divisional insignia onto trucks. They sewed the right shoulder patches onto their own uniforms and changed them when the assignment changed. They posted fake military police at crossroads. 2 officers would drive into a French town wearing the stars of a general, walk into a cafe where German sympathizers were known to drink, and talk carelessly about a unit that was 300 miles away. Then they would leave and let the town do the rest. Put the 4 together, and 1,100 men could impersonate a force of 2 divisions, roughly 30,000 soldiers, for several days at a time. That is the arithmetic that makes this unit remarkable, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Not a raid, not a battle, not a single act of individual courage. 1,100 men, a great many of whom had been sitting in art school classrooms 2 years earlier, standing in an empty field in France and persuading a professional army with 4 years of combat behind it that an entire corps was in front of them. There is an obvious problem with a unit whose entire purpose is to be noticed, and every man in it understood it inside the first week. The deception only works if the enemy looks. If the enemy looks hard enough or comes close enough or decides to shell the position rather than maneuver around it, then 1,100 lightly armed men are standing in the open, pretending to be an armored division, with rubber for armor and a phonograph record for artillery. There is no version of that fight they win. Their only protection was that the enemy believed them. That was not a theoretical danger. The unit took casualties. 3 of its men were killed during the campaign in Europe, and dozens more were wounded, most of them by artillery falling on positions that had been advertised as valuable precisely so that German guns would take an interest in them. Those 3 deaths are worth stating plainly, because this story is almost always told as a clever caper with a happy ending. It was not a caper to the 3 families who received a telegram, or to the men who were underneath the shell fire that the deception had deliberately invited. The first operation, in Normandy in July 1944, was called Elephant, and by the unit's own later assessment, it was not much good. The men were inexperienced, the equipment was new, and the coordination between the 4 subunits was poor. In August, outside the port of Brest in Brittany, a larger effort produced mixed results at best. There is a version of this story in which the Ghost Army never failed. That version is not supported by the unit's own after-action reports, and the men themselves were the first to say so. Their own internal assessment of Elephant used the word disappointing. What changed was practice. By the autumn, the unit had learned that the visual deception alone convinced nobody, that sound without radio traffic sounded like a recording, and that the whole apparatus only worked when all 4 weapons were fired together and the timing was exact. In September and October, at Bettemberg in Luxembourg, they held a gap in the American line where there was very nearly nothing, and they held it for around a week. That was the point at which the outfit became genuinely dangerous to the German army, rather than merely interesting. By March 1945, the 9th United States Army was preparing to cross the Rhine near Wesel, and it needed the German command to look somewhere else. The deception assigned to the 23rd was the largest it ever attempted, and it was given a name, Operation Viersen. The unit would impersonate two full infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th, roughly 10 miles south of where the real crossing would be made, and hold that impression for long enough to matter. If it failed, the 9th Army would be crossing a defended river. It took 6 days. Rubber tanks and guns went into position where the two divisions would have assembled. Speaker half-tracks pushed the sound of bridging equipment and armor across the river through the nights. Radio operators took over the traffic of both divisions while the real formations moved north under radio silence. Painted insignia went onto vehicles, shoulder patches were changed, and men in the uniforms of two divisions that were not there walked around a German town buying small things in shops and letting themselves be seen doing it. Something happened during Viersen that had not happened in any earlier operation. The deception was so thorough and the ground so exposed that the 23rd had to request real artillery support and real fighter cover in order to make the fiction survive scrutiny. For 6 days, a unit of 1,100 men was being defended as though it were 30,000, because if it had been seen for what it actually was, the entire crossing plan to the north would have been compromised. The lie had grown heavy enough that it now needed real guns to protect it. It held. The German command kept forces facing a position where two American divisions were not, and on the 24th of March the real crossing went into the north. The official assessment, made afterwards by the 9th Army's own staff, was that the deception had drawn substantial German attention and reserves away from the true point of attack and had held it there through the critical days. It is the single clearest thing this unit ever did in 11 months of operations, and almost nobody outside the 9th Army staff knew at the time that it had happened at all. Estimates of how many American lives that saved run from 15,000 to 30,000. I want to be careful with that number because it is a professional estimate and not a count of anything. It comes from post-war assessments of what a contested crossing would have cost against what the real one did cost. It gets repeated everywhere, usually with the word estimate quietly removed. If you have seen a source that puts a firmer figure on it, post it below, because I could not find one, and the men of the unit were more careful about this than most of the retellings are. The war in Europe ended 6 weeks later, and the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops went home under an instruction that would govern the rest of their lives. The operation remained classified. They were not to discuss what they had done with anyone, including their families. The Army's reasoning was not unreasonable at the time, and it deserves to be stated fairly. Tactical deception was a live capability, the Soviet Union was the obvious next opponent, and a method that has been described in a newspaper is a method that no longer works on anybody. So they said they were engineers. They went home to Indiana and New York and Pennsylvania, and they built ordinary lives on top of a hole where the most extraordinary thing they had ever done should have been. Bill Blass went into fashion and became famous for something else entirely. Ellsworth Kelly went to Paris and became a painter of enormous international reputation. Neither man talked about the war. For most of the 1100, there was no famous second career to fill the space, and no reason anybody would ever think to ask. There was only the space. Here is what I did not expect to find, and it is the thing that has stayed with me since. It was not the fame they missed. Several of them said late in life that the hardest part was their fathers. These were men of the generation that had fought in France in 1918, who wanted to know what their sons had done in the war, and who died without being told. One veteran described sitting through his own father's questions about the war year after year and giving him the engineer answer every single time, until there were no more questions because there was no longer a father to ask them. The classification held for 51 years. The relevant records were not released until 1996, by which time a great many of the 1100 were dead. The men who were left were then in their 70s. Some of them found that nobody particularly believed them. The story sounds invented because the whole thing was designed to sound like something that was not there, and a man of 74 explaining that he spent the war inflating rubber tanks and playing records at the German army does not always get taken at his word, even inside his own family. There is a fair case for the silence, and it deserves stating properly rather than being dismissed. Deception is a capability, not a stunt. The techniques the 23rd developed were used again, and telling the world how they worked in 1946 would have destroyed them. Every intelligence service in the world would have read it. The men were soldiers, they were given a lawful order, and at the moment it was given the order had a real and serious reason behind it. That is the strongest argument for the silence, and I think it is largely correct as far as it goes. But 51 years is not an operational timeline. It is a lifetime, and here is the part I cannot get past. The specific techniques were obsolete long before 1996. Rubber tanks stopped fooling anybody once reconnaissance aircraft carried infrared and radar, which was well before the end of the 1950s. The capability the classification was protecting had been dead for decades while the order was still being obeyed by men in their 60s. Nobody reviewed it. It simply stayed shut because nothing and nobody ever made anyone open it. That is my honest view, and you are welcome to disagree with it below, because the people who study this genuinely do disagree. The secrecy was right in 1945 and probably still right in 1955. Somewhere between 1965 and 1985, it stopped being a security measure and turned into an administrative habit, and the entire cost of that habit was paid by a group of men who had no way to appeal it, nobody in particular to ask, and no way of knowing that the reason behind it had quietly expired years earlier. Recognition, when it came in the way recognition usually comes. Legislation awarding the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal was signed on the 1st of February, 2022. The ceremony was held on the 21st of March, 2024, 79 years almost to the day after Operation Viersen. Of the 1,100 men, a handful were alive to attend. Most of the medals were received by children and grandchildren, on behalf of men who had spent 5 decades telling their own families that they had been engineers in France. So what were they? 1,100 men, 4 small units, 21 operations, 3 dead, and a Rhine crossing that cost less than it should have. A fashion designer, a painter, a photographer, and 1,000 others whose names are attached to nothing at all. They spent 1 year doing something no army had done at that scale, and 51 years not mentioning it. If someone in your family served in the 23rd, or in any unit whose work stayed classified long past the point where it mattered, put their name below. A like on this puts 1,100 names in front of a few more people, which is roughly what they were owed and did not get.